I just want to say a few words. I'm Sonia Recasens, AICA International Office Assistant. So I will be your host for today's webinar. I just want to remind you to keep your mics off for everyone's convenience. You can leave your comments and questions in the chat. So I also remind you that this webinar is being recorded. So in few days, few weeks, it will be available on our YouTube channel, where you can find already, I think, dozens of webinars in English, in Spanish, and in French from very different national section and art critics. I'm very happy to host this webinar supported by AICA International and organized by AICA Poland, AICA Hungary, AICA Slovakia, and AICA Czech Republic. I will give the floor to Arkadiusz Półtorak, who will moderate the roundtable, and enjoy.
Thank you very much, Sonia. Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. As I can see in the chat and in this bar above the main field of the Zoom interface, we are today among a very international crowd, which makes me very happy, and I'm sure it's a shared feeling here. Thank you very much for joining us. My name is Arkadiusz Półtorak. I am the Secretary General of AICA Poland, and I will be moderating today's roundtable discussion. First, I'd like to say thanks to Małgorzata Kaźmierczak, the Vice President of AICA International, but also of AICA Poland, who took the lead in organizing this event. And Gosia, thank you for inviting me to be a part of it. We have gathered here to discuss the anchor themes and the scope of the upcoming anthology of critical texts written in Central and Eastern European countries after 1989, a publication project that has luckily received the attention and generous support of the International Visegrad Fund, as well as AICA International, and is currently unfolding at a rather quick pace. This groundbreaking and useful initiative would not have happened weren't it for the selfless and time-consuming engagement of many people, including Małgorzata herself, who acts as the project coordinator, but also among all the presidents of Czech, Hungarian, Slovakian, and Polish sections of AICA International. So respectively, Hanna Lawrowa, Attila Horányi, Lidia Pribisova, and Magdalena Ujma. It also definitely wouldn't have happened without the tremendous support from critics and curators who volunteered to take part in the steering committee. Vlasta Noschirova from the Czech Republic, Katalin Balasz, Aaron Fenveshi, and Juliusz Hut from Hungary, and our Slovakian colleagues, Jana Garzova and Maria Chlawajova. A huge thanks to all of you, and bravo for the groundbreaking work you have already done to popularize, situate, reframe, and so to speak, decompress the critical discourse in Visegrad countries after 1989. I am sure that the upcoming publication will perform all of these things and much more for readers all over the world. It might be somewhat ironic that the role of today's moderator was assigned to me, so a critic who was born shortly after the revolutionary year of 1989, and who has but a bleak and blurry memory of the economic transformation, but also cultural transformation in Poland, and who could hardly act as an expert in the matters we will be discussing today. But I consider my role not only ironic, it is also to a certain extent symbolic. The aim of the publication is not just to represent the development of critical discourse in Central and Eastern Europe within the last 30-something years. It is also to engage with the discussions that are being held in the global art world right now, today, and to present possible perspectives for rereading the local traditions in art criticism in view of the key issues or urgencies that that gather attention within these international debates, such as decoloniality, critique of extractivist capitalism, or identity politics. Since, as I mentioned before, I can hardly act as an expert in today's forum, we have invited 4 guests who can navigate much more freely in the matters at hand. So please let me introduce them to you. First, welcome to, and I hope she has already joined us, to Marta Smalikova, who is an art historian and a Czech expert in cultural policy and arts management. Since 2016, she has been acting as the director of the nonprofit organization Open Society. And since 2020, she's also a chairwoman of the Czech Women's Lobby and vice chairwoman of the Government Council for Gender Equality. She is also a member of the Radio and Television Broadcasting Council in Czech Republic. Good afternoon, Marta. I hope you are already among us. Then we have also invited from Hungary, Attila Horányi, who is the director of the Institute for Theoretical Studies at Moholy Nagy University of Art and Design. He holds an MA in art history and a PhD in aesthetics, both from Eötvös Loránd University in Budapest. Dr. Horányi was a Fulbright scholar at the Cultural Anthropology Department at Northwestern University, and currently he serves as the president of the Hungarian section of AICA International. Welcome. From Poland comes Dorota Monkiewicz, who is an art historian, curator, art critic. For nearly 2 decades, she has been working as a curator of modern and contemporary art at the National Museum in Warsaw. In the years of 2005 to 2007, she was also working in the programming committee of the new Museum of Contemporary Art in Warsaw. And since March 2009, she was leading the project of founding a new Museum of Contemporary Art in Wrocław. She also served as the founding director of the institution in years 2011-2016. And she was also the president of Polish section of AICA. Good afternoon, Dorota.
Good afternoon.
And last but definitely not least, welcome Jana Garzova, an art historian and critic and editor-in-chief of the magazine Profil. Before 1989, she cooperated with several artists on the, we could say, unofficial scene in Slovakia. And after the revolutionary year, as I have called it, she co-founded this fine art magazine Profil. And since 1992, she has been acting as the editor-in-chief. She was the president of the Slovak section of AICA between 2000 and 2007. And she also worked at the Academy of Fine Arts at the Institute of Arts and Sciences. Welcome, our dear speakers.
Hello. Hello.
Before I proceed to ask questions, please also let me share a few practical notes. Since there is quite a lot of us here, I would like to ask all of you who have any questions and comments once again to send them in the chat. I will try to weave these questions into our discussion, particularly during the second hour of the webinar, possibly after a short break, a 3-minute break, which I plan to fit in after the first hour. But let's see how our conversation flows and if we can allow this to happen. I would also like to ask all the invited speakers to try to fit in their answers within 5 or so minutes slots, so we can allocate an equal amount of time and attention to all the countries involved in this project. I won't be, necessarily counting your time, but I just ask, please, let's all act in the spirit of generosity and kindness. And now, without further ado, let me proceed to the first round of questions. And I will begin with a question that very much references the publication in the making. And the publication is roughly divided into a few, namely 9 themes. The first is the representation of the economic and political and cultural transition after 1989. The second is gender and body. The third, feminism. Then otherness and politics of identities. Further, institutional critique, political art and censorship, art and public spaces, critique of critique, and last but not least, perspectives on pre-1989 art. My question to our guests would be, which of these themes do you deem most important or simply most relevant from the viewpoint of your respective countries? In other words, which of those themes correspond most directly to the dominant conventions, positions, or themes in post-1989 critical writing on art and culture in your respective countries? And if any one of you wants to volunteer,
okay, I can start.
Great.
I was thinking about your questions you sent us in advance. And in fact, there's a historical question, because the subject matters were undergoing a change since 1989 on. And from my point of view, in Poland, the first, some of the subject matters you listed overlap each other. But in general, I would say that directly after 1989, this political art and censorship were the first decade. This was the most important subject matter. It was, of course, connected also with the matters of the body and of the otherness. And afterwards, around this is your questions really caused me to analyze what happened when and how this critical debate was developing in Poland. And then for me, the next subject matter of the matters you listed was the art of women. Because in 2000, there was the first edition of the exhibition "A Woman About a Woman" in Bielsko-Biała, and this I recall as the beginning of the really serious discussing the subject matter. The first texts appeared in the 90s, but really since this exhibition on, this debate got more strong. That was very strange because we had this problem with abortion, but the debate was not that strong in art and in art criticism, which was even an argument against women critics, that they don't, criticism in general, even not only women, that art and art criticism doesn't touch this case enough in the 90s. And the next stage is the matters of economy in art, and this I connect with who is founding the Krytyka Polityczna magazine, which happened in 2002. And in 2004, Artur Żmijewski joined the team as a graphic designer of Krytyka Polityczna. But it was also the moment when the Art Institute in Gdańsk also started its activities, and there happened a very important meeting between the authors of Krytyka Polityczna, who were politologs,
political writers, not art
political writers, and they met the artists and art critics in Gdańsk, and it was in 2004. That was the exhibition BHP, Health and Safety Regulations. It was the title of the whole project. It was the exhibition, and afterwards it was a conference. And the last subject matter, it is the institutional critique, and I would see the peak of this matter on the turn of 2013 and 14, according to Winter Holiday Camp in the CCA, in the Center of Contemporary Art in Warsaw. So I see the sequence of the subject matters of art criticism in this way. Of course, if there is a publication, it must have been much stronger explained and checked and researched. But for the needs of this discussion, I think that this account is enough at this moment. Thank you.
But you, sorry to kind of pull your tongue in a way, as we say in Polish, but you skipped over the 90s in a sense, and why?
Because for me it's obvious. Yes, I published this article in the book about Libera, so I didn't want to speak much about it simply. So you have to ask me, what would you like to know about the 90s?
I understand that from your perspective.
My mind went further, in the meantime, yeah? Because what happened in the 90s, it is quite obvious, but the flow of time afterwards is quite complicated, and this really attracted my attention for the sake of this discussion at this panel.
Thank you, Dorota.
No, I can give a general account of the 90s. Speaking very general, we had two sources for art criticism. One, it was the criticism of which is connected with Zeszyty Literackie, which was a dissident magazine published abroad. And this was the older generation of art critics who very much connected art criticism with the literature criticism, and who occurred in time a very quite a conservative critics, which were connected with, because of some personal also links with the classical painting, let's say, and in general with the traditional medias like painting, sculpture, graphic, and after 1989 there appeared, but not immediately after 1989, but maybe 1993-94, a new generation of art critics who were very aware of mixed media, various media installations, but for the most, they were the speakers of the time. I mean, of this very, very hard time of transformation in Poland, who were involved in this process, and who, quoting Piotr Piotrowski, they were involved in creating a new language to write about art, to speak about art, and who were involved in these cultural wars which happened in Poland in the 90s. I think that for the moment, this should be enough. Thank you.
Was the situation any similar in Slovakia?
Yes, and also not. Maybe I would like to stay with the issue of representation of transition. This is the first theme in anthology, and I mean it is very important, and the theme which is common to all post-totalitarian countries. And what is important that it started, which have passed from euphoria because of collapse of the Soviet Empire to disappointment when economics transformation was associated with predatory, so-called predatory capitalism, including wild privatization, political corruption, and naive notion that the free market is the only key to prosperity. There were even voices say that only the art which make money on yourself has to survive. I would like to underline that the interpretation of the transition is still open process, and this is also illustrated by critical writing which we propose to the anthology. While the critics and artists of my generation have been deeply immersed in the reality of 90s, over time, critical reflection began to emerge. The question is whether this growing criticism is probably of different generation, or is it related to the current economic, political, and environment crisis. The last exhibition that mapped the period of transition was in Bratislava this year. And the curators were very, very critical of transition. They even questioned the Western economic and political model, and they were very critical of our generation for not being able to seek our own path independent on the West. These curators belong to the generation that has not experienced the enthusiasm for freedom began after fall of the Iron Curtain, and this helped us, our generation, to overcome the negatives of transition. Can this be the reason for their greater frustration with the world we live? This is question. They probably believe that our decision made in 1989 has resulted in the current crisis. This question is how we should have done it differently. Do we have the answer? And did the curators of the exhibition have them? And maybe it is the question for all us. The second topic, like my colleague from Poland, is the reflection of gender, body, feminism, and otherness of identities. In our selection for the anthology, we have most contribution which maps the whole spectrum of problems as the gender inequality, violence against women, advocacy of LGBT community rights, the fight for the rights for transgender people, including activist protests. These protests were, for instance, again repeated effort to legislate a ban on abolition or against non-signing of the Istanbul Protocol. I would like to underline that feminism is not the mainstream of art in Slovakia, and in 1990s was misunderstood and rejected. But the feminist discourse has significantly changed the minds of many, many artists, and through their works, a large number of visitors of the exhibitions. Also, many examples of institutional critique are associated directly with feminism. I would like to mention only one exhibition, which under the title Nude, Uncensored Works by Modern Masters, was in Slovak National Gallery in 2010. The ambition of 3 female curators was to look at the female nude of prominent Slovak modern and late modern artists through the lens of feminist criticism. The exhibition provoked stormy reaction, mainly because the women, the objects of the male erotic fantasy, became a subject that shows a crooked mirror for the male genius. And the third areas which I would pay attention is political art and censorship. In the context of these topics, situation in Slovakia was during the 90s very complicated because Vladimir Mečiar came to the power between 1993 and 1998. And this period was marked by a return to authoritarian rule within all the negative signs, including the kidnapping of the president's son managed by the Slovak information service. For art, this meant suppressing a plurality of artistic view. National culture became the ideal, and experimental art was again suppressed as an unacceptable cosmopolitan formalism. At the time, critical writing was replaced by artistic and political activism. We together organized protests against the manipulating with the public finance dedicated for culture, the political dismissal of the director of the most successful galleries, non-respect for tender EJ selection for the Czech and Slovak pavilion in Venice. This was a result in a big public protest in 1995 against the concept of Slovak culture, which was signed by thousands of Slovak intellectuals. And I must add that these who signed this protest risked they could lose their job or were otherwise punished. The period was exposed map by an exhibition prepared in 2014 by a team of young curators entitled Curatorial Concepts in Period of Mečiarism. I choose these three thematic areas, which does not mean that others didn't find a response in Slovakia. I will also return to them through topics such as the dichotomy West versus East, or phenomenon as a colonization, self-colonization, and decolonization, which we will discuss later. Thank you.
Thank you. I can already see that all of these motives are woven into the history of art and art criticism in all of our countries, but the periodization differences might be actually very interesting to compare, for instance, the 90s in Slovakia with what is going on right now in Polish culture. That seems like a very inspiring project. Attila, how does it look like from the Hungarian perspective?
It looks pretty complicated, and I'm not really going into many details about the last, let's say, 30 years of our country's history, because it would be very, very difficult and also not very effective in terms of understanding how our criticism functioned in these decades. And in fact, my colleagues here who are editing our contribution to this volume decided to focus on the 90s, really to understand what was happening at the very early phase of this kind of more liberated, more free period of our country or of our region. And so I'm going to concentrate on that. And if when I was looking through your questions and the possibilities, you know, what type of art criticism stands out as perhaps the most important in this period, I decided that it's probably the institutional critique, and I'm going to try to explain why that is so. It does not mean that there was no other voice at the time. There was some, but perhaps not that much. And the reason is I think the following. You know, art criticism was not a profession that was taught at any universities or you know, anywhere basically. It was art historians who studied, you know, it was people studying art history who turned turned to contemporary art and art criticism. And the methods they had before 1989 were fairly perhaps formal, perhaps kind of art historical, that is explanatory. They were trying to explain what's going on. And also it was, at one point, one of the foremost, you know, one of the best art critics and art historians of the period of the avant-garde, Laszlo Becker, explained to me that in the 70s and 80s, writing a bad review meant that you were actually reporting to, basically to officials. It was, in a sense, inappropriate. So either you were silent about bad, you know, bad art or bad exhibitions, or you were writing positively. And that remained with us actually until the fall of the Berlin Wall and later. So that means that, and second, those theories and methods actually that characterize art criticism in the last perhaps 10, 20 years, even Hungarian art criticism, not that much though, it's not very theory oriented art criticism, but those things like feminism or feminist perspective or post-nationalist perspective or other perspectives were really not available after the Berlin Wall fell, because most people were educated before that. That means that they had no methods for that. And this means that what critics were trying to focus on was the appearance of new institutions that were markedly different from old institutions, old art institutions like galleries and so on. So one of the more important things in this country, in fact, in the region as well, was the appearance in the 80s of the Soros Foundation and also the Center for Culture and Communication that was actually very powerful and dynamic in organizing exhibitions and so on. And so this was one such venue. Also, Pro Helvetia helped founding an association of non-profit organizations and galleries like Studio Gallery that's connected to young artists, also to Óbudai Társaskönyv and other smaller venues, or Liget Gallery, Vannak Tibor's Liget Gallery and others that were markedly different from the larger institutions like Micsarnok and National Gallery and all others. And that meant that their production was markedly different. And this created kind of like a gap between the big institutions and the smaller ones. And from the smaller ones, and especially the curators and the artists, and also those who were running these institutions, the smaller institutions, created an institutional critique that was directed against or let's say against these larger institutions and also the powers behind them. So I'd say this is part of the story, and the other part of the story is that conceptual art was very strong in Hungary in the 80s and also in the 90s and 2000s. And this conceptual art meant a conceptual thinking about art and about artistic institutions, and that also led to institutional critiques. So that appears both in art and in art criticism, and this is one of the reasons I suppose that that we focus on that. An important exhibition was 1993 Polyphony's exhibition, which was, social issues on, and also it was the public space as a media for art. That was one of the first actual big events that the Soros Foundation organized with Benčík Barna, was then the galleries, the studio gallery and the young artist gallery. And he actually, through that intervention, kind of like questioned the methods, the ways of the larger institutions were working, questioned these, and this was translated again into kind of like an institutional critique. So what I'd like to say is that most of our more important actors at the time were trying to address this problem, and this is what actually characterized the 1990s. Even though there was, for instance, one important exhibition, Water Test, in 1995, which was a markedly feminist intervention, actually, at the Óbudai Társasკör, for instance. So other types of voices also appeared through curatorship and reflection on those events. But it was largely, trying to take stock of what was happening in the 70s and 80s in terms of institution, in terms of the institution of art history, in terms of the institution of art criticism. That was one of the things, and taking stock of what's happening with smaller venues, markedly different from the larger and more official ones. That's what I'd like to add to here.
Thank you, Attila. The question that came to my mind when you were speaking was the question concerning the difference or maybe similarity of the institutional system before 1989 and post 1989, and maybe you could also elaborate a little bit on this subject in the next round, because it actually links with the second question I am going to ask to all of you. In Poland, for instance, in the 90s, we sort of inherited a certain institutional system from the times of the socialist republic, and transformed it, sort of corrected it, changed the formal identity of these institutions, but it more or less remained the same, which is interesting. The question now is, as I mentioned, the last chapter of the anthology will be dedicated to the contemporary perspectives on the pre-1989 art in Central and Eastern European countries. And now this theme begs a reflection on how the shift has been conceptualized in the socio-cultural imagination that art critics reflect, but also co-create. So thinking in both artistic and sociological terms, has the experience of the transition been described in the respective countries you come from as a radical break, or was it in fact more of an evolution, kind of a smooth transition? And maybe let's go back to Dorota.
It's a very difficult question, I have to say, Arkadiusz. First, I would like to come back to this what was said before, because what is I'm listening to, hearing this conceptual point of view in Hungary or in Slovakia. Also other institutions, and as far as I understood, and this we heard about the joy of freedom in Slovakia. I understand that it was a big impact, In Poland, it was a big thing, but it was not represented in art, in fact, and in art criticism. This is what I what I think I should say. It was in the society, but not in art, and art criticism went another way. And I didn't want to say this, but I have to say it, though it is very banal in our Polish discussion, that what was important after 1989, it happened under the sign of Michel Foucault, Ibra and Brach-China, two writers who made a big influence, who had a big influence on the art scene. Yeah, so the meaning of the body was very much politicized in the 90s, and of course there was the need to reflect on the time before 1989. But in the beginning, the most important was to show all the underground activities which were held in the 80s. So there was the whole series of exhibitions in Zachęta Art Gallery showing this underground art, or this art out of censorship. It was a lot of, there were a lot of initiatives, unofficial, which happened in the 80s. So this whole sequence of reviews, the review of given galleries, active people, artists, currents, lasted the whole 1990 and 1991, and 2 years. And the only exhibition, important exhibition, which had a relation to the previous art history was the exhibition by Derkovic in CCA in 1991, which tried to somehow conceptualize the experience of social realism and in general art with the strong sign of communism. In fact, after 1989, besides this one exhibition, because we had the discussion before in the 80s about the 50s and 60s and the official and the state politics, cultural politics. So this was not so hot potato in the 90s because it was already discussed in the 80s. During especially one important seminar, which was run by Wojciech Włodarczyk, was a chairman, I think, by the Society of the Art Historians. So it was rather summarizing what happened in the underground or in the official scene. This was the reaction for in the change, to show it overground, what happened underground. And the new relation to this past, to this communist past, happened in art and following the art criticism after 2000, when in general the methods of the class, social class, came into view. Yeah, that it started to be interesting for the artists and for the people after 2000, and founding the Krytyka Polityczna magazine was a clear sign that this history comes back, but not as a negative, example, but as an example which must go under reflection. That's it, I think, my answer.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Jana.
Yes.
What is your perspective?
Yes. I must say that Slovakia, it was a radical break, but there were a lot of problems. First of all, it was necessary to revise the Slovak art history of the 20th century. This meant not only interpreting the artists of so-called unofficial scene, but also a critical reading of the past, especially the period of the orthodox social realism in 50s and softer form of social realism in 70s. it was a long process that resulted in the exhibition and publication. The title was The 20th Century, the History of Slovak Fine Art, in a concept of Zora Rusinova, which was in 2000, more than 10 years after revolution, on the Slovak National Gallery. But in this context, I would like to pay attention to the one specific problem. Maybe we must talk about new phenomenon then came into discussion in the end of 90s after this phenomenon we can call self-colonization. It was opened by the Bulgarian theorist Alexander Kiosev with the text Note on the Self-Colonizing Culture, which was published in the catalogue of the exhibition After the Wall in 1999. This theory is based on the permission that, unlike violent historical overseas colonization, self-colonizing culture are those that adopt foreign Western values and civilization models themselves, and through this foreign model colonize their own authenticity, and what is important, do so with love. In 2008, we opened a discussion on this topic in our magazine profile. All participants agreed that if we accept Kiosev theory, we will accept the fact that we belong to the non-Western cultures. But our history illustrated that we are part of Western history, at the minimum from Renaissance, Romanesque art. And what is important, we do not belong to the culture powers, but we are not exotic others. This is the problem which is open, but in the younger generation are some colleagues who think that we have adopted Western modernity and suppressed our authenticity. They are talking about Westernization, but this is an issue that needs to be discussed. And there is also a question, what is our authenticity? It is a folklore. And maybe I will have with the example of Maria Bartusová, her work. Now Maria Bartusová is an artist who was born in Czech Republic, and all her life she was part of Slovak culture. She lived in east of Slovakia in Košice, and now after Documenta, I think 2007, where her works were presented, she is one of the most important European artists. Her collection is also on Venice Biennale this year. And I would like to say that her work does not hang in a vacuum. It can be read in the context of Western art history, and yet it is very, very original. And same example is abstract painting of Esther Šimerová-Martinčeková, who was born 1999, who studied in Paris at Académie Julienne, and in 30, and later she became a private student and friend of Alexandra Exter, one of avant-garde Russia artists. She lived in Paris. And what is important from my point of view is that this art is not mechanically accept the language of Western tendencies, not accepted it as a finished form. She participated in its transformation. And this is the open question. And I remember that this question of self-colonization was very strongly discussed in Budapest. I don't know how this problem was discussed in Poland or Czech Republic. Maybe this is a question from me.
Thank you, Anna. I think this question of self-colonization has also been very present in Polish art and criticism. But I would say that up to a certain point, which happened maybe 10 years ago, it was sort of an underground stream underlining or underpinning you know, the cultural production that was criticizing the consumption culture. It was not being spoken very directly until a certain point, I think around 2007 maybe, or 2010. Dorota might disagree, but this would be
I would like to say that we didn't use this word decolonization in those times, in the 90s. Maybe we didn't know this word. But the discussion about that somebody is not an original artist because he mimics what happens in the West lasted strongly until 1997, until the discussion about Libera. I don't recall strong arguments after discussion about Auschwitz, Lego Auschwitz. And this is one thing. But there was another context of this discussion about West and East. It was the discussion about art market, that the works by Polish artists don't achieve such prizes like the Western artists. It was one context of this discussion, and this was lasted quite long. And this was later, but earlier also, the comparison was about the infrastructure of the art scene under this respect, that the artist has no support. I mean that in Poland in the 90s, there were no galleries where the artist could sell his or her works on one hand, and there was no collectors and no buyers, but on the other hand, there was no state support for the artists. I mean that when I was making projects with German artists and Polish artists, the German artists were getting strong financial support from various organizations in Germany, and the Polish artists had no support. Nobody supported the Polish artists. So they were in the 90s really poor. The problem, though the discussion about poor artists really became very public after 2000, but in fact, the artists were the most poor in the 90s, where it was not really a subject of the public debate.
We will return to this subject later with the third question, but now I'd like to give way to Attila. And maybe this institutional thread of our discussion will become very vital now with your response.
Yeah, but the question was really very wide, and also some of the answers led or has been leading to various directions. So it's not too easy to to say anything. But what I'm going to try to do is give is perhaps elaborate a little bit on what I was saying from a different perspective. And so what I'd like now to draw your attention to is and this is going to reflect on the final topic, on the final topic, how we are relating to pre-1989 art and how we are kind of like understanding it and reviewing it, and perhaps in a different context representing it. And so what is, I think, significant from art criticism's point of view is that those artists who were, alive and working in the 70s and 80s, those artists who were not officially recognized as important artists, or were perhaps, there is this, I will not be able to translate it to you, but there is this conception in Hungary, the 3 T's, that there were artists who were suppressed, and some artists who were supported, and some artists who were in between, were tolerated, basically. And so, there were a number of artists who were suppressed and were unable to show basically anywhere, especially in the 70s. Somewhat better situation arose in the 80s. And there were a wide spectrum who were actually tolerated in some ways, but never got the recognition that they thought they deserve and whatever, because of their being, of their being apolitical, sort of perhaps too formalist, whatever. And so after 1989, they thought, perhaps with good reason, that this is their time. Most of them were in their late 40s, perhaps 50s and 60s, and they thought, okay, this is our time. We have arrived. And but the 1990s were pretty much in art, especially in Western art, and because the country's borders became easily crossable, to use this non-existent expression. So it was easy to cross the boundaries, the borders, easy to see what was going on. Art that was produced in Berlin, that was produced in Paris, but most importantly in New York, London, elsewhere, was coming in, ideas were coming in, young people were doing things that were markedly different. As I said, it was very strongly conceptual and very different from the painterly production of most artists in the 1980s and 70s. And so this created a generation clash, basically, and this was translated pretty much into some very heated debate concerning, one art historian, whom art critique wrote actually an important review. It was entitled Message to the Masters, and it was not taken very well, to be honest with you. Because he was trying to explain that, okay, that's all fine, but this is the past. This is a different period that we're living in. It's not that type of postmodernism, and much less that type of geometrical or whatever type of painterly art that's being produced. And so please give way. But those people were pretty upset because they never had the chance to arrive. This was somewhat complicated with the appointing of Laszlo Becker as the head of Műcsarnok, whose market kind of, in the 1990s. In fact, in 1991, he created an exhibition. There was an art historical exhibition about art in the 60s in Hungary, and that was again very important because it was trying not to show exclusively the neo-avant-garde art, but all kinds of art next to each other. It had a neo-avant-garde sort of direction. Also, it tried to explain it all in cultural and social, and also kind of like natural scientific context. But it was trying to say something about the 60s, and it was again criticized very heavily on various grounds. A little later on, he became the director of Műcsarnok, and his program was actually to introduce those basically friends, but also those important artists from the 60s and 70s who never had the chance to do this. And yet he also kind of like met with certain disagreements or perhaps skepticism. Is it this that we need to do? Is it really what is good in all of this? And that also met with some institutional critique. Is it right, to show these people? Is it right to think about them in this way? Perhaps we need. The important thing again here is that this was very closely related to art historical understanding and art historical knowledge. So it was not pure art criticism, but closely art history, and also to some sort of, cultural politics or politics inside the artistic scene, that is, who has power and who is left without power. So this power dynamics was also playing out. So this is not pure art criticism and understanding how it functioned, but also it's a very social, in that sense, very social, societal question, basically, what was going and how it was going on. So it's the art and its representation as art history. It's curating as major exhibitions in Hungary or elsewhere, around the world, and their critique in younger critics and also, again, smaller institutions, asking, is it what we are producing right now? Is it what culture is about right now? So perhaps this elaborated a little bit what I was saying beforehand.
And out of curiosity, since Jana brought up Bartuszova, Dorota brought up Libera, could you just name an artist or a couple of artists who would exemplify this underground current?
Yeah, Miklós Erdély was one of the big names, and it's a very strange and ironic situation, also very sad situation, that he had his big exhibition at Műcsarnok, and yet the catalog was never produced, which is almost unbelievable. And perhaps it says something about the very strange situation of art criticism, art history, also how we look at neo-avant-garde culture, and also how we look at what's happening in the art market. So it's a very strange combination. But I'd say Miklós Erdély, obviously, and also Tamás Szentjobbik, who came back to Hungary from Switzerland in 1991 and started teaching at the Academy of Fine Arts. He was also important. And obviously, some other important names like Dora Maurer, who also became a professor here at my university for a very short period of time. And in the early 1990s, she transferred to the Academy of Fine Arts and became a mentor of a wide, very different type of artists there, and still has a very strong power and presence. In fact, at our Power 50, she was named as the most powerful person in 2022 Hungary's art scene, which is quite incredible.
Dorota is asking for a short intervention. I give way to you. The microphone. We can't hear you.
We know all these names like Dora Maurer, Szentjobbik, or Erdély since the late 60s, when they were showing in our country. But my question is about the artists who appeared in the 90s, new artists, because in Poland, Libera, we can understand him as an artist of the 80s and 90s, not of the 70s.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I sorry, I misunderstood. I thought I should name a few ones who were at that point kind of resurfacing. Yeah, so it's Attila, for instance, who came to prominence, and then Antal Lochner, who came to prominence, or Remese Bencúr, and I could name probably a number of others. Yes, I'd say probably one of the most important ones is Attila Csörgő of all these. Yeah.
Could you write on chat the name?
Sure, I will.
Please, all of you, in the break, which I will introduce after the next question. Please write all the names that you've been sharing, because it's an important resource for all of us.
Okay.
Here, I think everyone will benefit. And now a third question that was already anticipated. by your previous answers. And I will ask this question, but just for the just to make sure, is Marta Smalikova maybe among us? No, if not, I will proceed to the last question in this round, which is, have the Cold War dichotomy between the East and the West shaped, and if so, in what way, the critical discourse after 1989 in your respective countries? I know this is an extremely broad question, but maybe you can provide some, again, topical examples of when this distinction broke in a certain way, or when this distinction maybe resurfaced. We've been already talking about this decolonizing discourse, and maybe this context is very vital here. So, Dorota, would you like to?
I have nothing in mind to comment on this. I'm thinking about the book. So I am moving the discussion on another field a little bit, because I'm thinking about the book which was translated in Poland and published maybe 1993 or something like this. It was the book by Serge Guibault, how this, I don't remember the exact title, but how New York stole the capital of art from Paris. And if we, and this was about CIA, it was about American politics in Europe after the war. This was about Cold War. This was about the West teaching the East about democracy. It was written by one of the authors from the October group, October magazine. And this was maybe the most influential book and discussion which happened about this Iron Curtain after the war. But if you want, we talked a little bit about this colonial discourse that the young artists were accused of following the artists in the West, and that they are not original and not creative. But this we said already, yeah. So, but it is important to say that it was in the everyday newspapers, this kind of discussions, in the daily newspapers, but on the deeper level, this reflecting on Iron Curtain was much more complex than this easy, this very easy, banal discourse of newspapers critique. This is why I want to introduce this Guibault into our discussion.
And I'd like to, again, pull your tongue, to use the Polish phrase in translation. How do you see it from today's perspective, when we see people like Andrzej Biernacki taking over important institutions in Poland and invoking what they call a sovereign thinking about art, vis-a-vis a thinking that is non-sovereign, which means most likely, too closely related to the Western institutions, capital, and discourses?
What can I say? I think that it is a very radical minority around Andrzej Biernacki. I mean, a very radical minority of art critics or artists who think in the same way. The majority of the art scene does not think in these terms. So how can I comment it? Yeah, there is always a margin in every public debate. Just a side thoughts and side opinions. Of course, because of political change in Poland, the side opinions suddenly, to our surprise, became in the very center. But it is only in the center of the political might, yeah. But it is not in the center, hopefully, maybe I'm not right, but in my opinion, it is not in the center of the art scene or critics context, yeah, criticism. I don't know, but maybe I'm not right. But when I'm looking at Szum or at Dwutygodnik and newspapers which are connected with the contemporary art, I don't see these opinions, and I don't see this problem. We have a problem with Biernacki, not with the West.
Thank you, Dorota. And what's your perspective, Jana, or what's Slovakia's perspective, so to speak?
Maybe I am going back to the basic question about the dichotomy West versus East, and because I mean this is key issues, and of course has a long history. We can divide it into the period before the Cold War and after the Cold War. And at the first glance, it might seem that there will be a gradual synchronization between the West and East after the fall of the Iron Curtain, but the opposite is true. Relationship have become even more complicated. Western Europe continued to play the position of the most important player. The expectation of post-totalitarian countries to integrate quickly into European artistic structure have remained unfulfilled. And what is important, several projects have emerged from this disillusion. This is well illustrated by the book East Art Map with the subtitle Contemporary Art and Eastern Europe. Book was published in 2006 by Slovenian group Irvin. And the book's ambition was to reconstruct the missing history of Eastern European art from the authentic Eastern European perspective. And on my opinion, it was a reaction to the fact that so-called Eastern Europe art was to the Western art history of the 20th century included only selectively or was completely excluded. And this is one of the most important questions we art historians and critics discuss in Slovakia, not only at the time, but also long time from the 1989 till now. Maybe this notion, and maybe I would like pay attention that we can see some change how we or how critics in Slovakia interpret, for instance, Western art from the 1945 till 60s. Recently, a critical reading of Western culture diplomacy have emerged. Maria Orišková analyzed important exhibition of American abstract art in 14th and 16th years, which was in Czechoslovakia. And what was for me very interesting and important, she reads them as a hidden tools of ideological propaganda. And this is, from my point of view, a very big change to look at the for instance, abstract American paintings. And on the other hand, for instance, we also register a new reading of artists who played a negative role in the period of social realism in the 50s. For instance, exhibition Ladislav Chemický has a very big exhibition now in Liptovský Mikuláš, and the title of this exhibition is Painter, Teacher, Communist, Official. And this is maybe the one new interpretation that this younger generation didn't read this artist only from his position as communist official, but also discover his work which he made before 1950. And this is from my generation something what was not interesting for us. But the next generation try to read it much more complex, maybe.
It seems like Serge Guilbault proved important not only in Poland, but also in Slovakia. Thank you, Jana. Would you like to add anything? Because I'm not sure if I interrupted you or you've already finished.
No, thank you.
Thank you. Attila, what's your perspective on the East and West issue?
Again, pretty complicated. I think what I'd say is that, after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the borders opening up and people kind of having a chance to sort of visit countries more often than, once in 3 years and kind of stay there and see, and also go to residences and other similar situations, and see that, the amount of money that's going into kind of culture and also into contemporary art, and the way this is all produced in the West, and the amount of books that's being produced there, and the amount of papers, and so all this plenitude, I think, was really in some ways a shock. And in that sense, I think, but this is pretty personal, because I was, I graduated from college in 1990 or 1991. So the world opened up, just as some of you mentioned it before, and in a way, the West appeared here like the Soros Center for Culture and Communication, but other institutions appeared here and kind of like tried to help, and in a way it seemed appropriate that perhaps they are more advanced and they know it better. And so I think the 1990s went by with much of this, trying to catch up. And in a sense, Kiosev's idea of self-colonization was pretty appropriate then. And I think it was written at that time, and perhaps in the early 2000s as well. But if we look back at these, let's say 30 years, I'd say the second part of these 30 years is really not marked by this at all, but by something else. And this is, how much money is spent on culture, and who is spending it on culture, and are there private foundations that are more free in that sense, and what our respective governments think how a national culture should prevail, and how that should work, what it should look like. And because here in Hungary, we have like 12 years of Fidesz government now, but even before it got more and more centralized, even that kind of liberal or leftist liberal government was also trying, because of lack of resources, it was trying to centralize certain institutions and trying to sort of dictate. We had this National Cultural Fund. I think it's like 30 years old now, or close to 30 years old. And there's always a shift between how much the profession is giving out, that is the professional curators, and how much the Minister of Culture, who has a say in this, is giving out. Is it like 10%? Is it like 5%? Or is it like 30%? And if it's 30%, that means that it's the central government who is actually intervening and putting out money into institutions that it favors, and it's not given out to by the professionals to sort of more worthy places. So what I'm seeing right now is not that the West is colonizing, let's say, in any ways the East, or the East is self-colonizing, East Central Europe is colonizing in any ways, self-colonizing in any ways itself, but how much money or power it has to represent itself within the region, like Hungary within this region, and outside this region. Are we able to make it to the Art Basel? Are we able to make it to Parifoto? Are we able to make it to whatever, wherever? And can we create? I mean, are we able to create, important art historical knowledge that would support our artists, and that could represent artistic culture that's been going on here in Hungary, in French, in English, in German, in various parts of the world? Are we able to do this? So in that sense, I would say that Hungary pretty much lacks that, lacks a. I don't think I'd say it does not look at contemporary fine art as a means of cultural diplomacy, as opposed to classical music, for instance, or perhaps some kind of literature. Those are pretty well subsidized by the government, by the state, whereas contemporary fine art is always seen, especially those that we're talking about, the more important contemporary art, is always seen as critical, as perhaps way too costly, ununderstandable by most people. It's pretty much a socialist realist kind of criticism towards contemporary art. It's just, it's not for the masses. Why subsidize it? And yet that art that they'd like to subsidize is not a possible means of cultural diplomacy, whereas the art that would be important and that would need the art historical books that would need a subsidization by the government to be produced are just not happening. I'm not sure if I was clear enough in that sense. So I think there's been a shift in this whole thing. The question now is not so much how West colonizes the East, but rather how the East, especially Hungary in this sense, because obviously I can speak of that, with any authority, how the East is able to represent itself in an affluent Western, situation. Basically that's it.
I'm sure this sentiment is at least in our region shared and very clear. It's 6:30, my dear guests and my dear speakers. I would suggest that we take a short 3-minute break to take a sip of coffee or a cigarette, and then come back And even though I have prepared even more questions, I think this is a great moment to invite all the participants to give their questions or responses. And here my suggestion would be that if some of you want to speak, please write your question in the chat during this break or shortly after the break. And then I will try to collect all of them and then give way to our speakers so they can answer one by one. I think this is the most convenient way. First, let's collect all the questions and then let the speakers speak. Marta van Bechelen asked Dorota Monkiewicz for an interpretation of the invite that Zofia Kulik received from the Venice Biennial, or from the organizers of the Polish Pavilion. Almost 10 years after 1989, Dorota has already answered in the chat, but maybe she will want to comment on it further. And then two questions that are rather rhetorical in their phrasing. Katie Deepwell asked, is it the creep of capitalism as a norm, the idea that there is no alternative? And Karachi Biennale Trust, so it is not the institution as such, but Niloufur Farouk, I guess, asked economic colonization as opposed to political colonization, perhaps, with respect to the conversation we ended on. And then Dalia Manor asked, was there an organized effort by the governments or public institutions to export art from your countries to the Western cultural centers, or a preference to spread the new art to local audiences? And from Jean Bundy, given the return of more conservative regimes in the world at large, how much artistic freedom is regressing from the 90s? I think two big themes emerge from this. One is the cultural economy, or and how art institutions and art criticism have responded to it, to the global colonial capitalist political economy, but also how they co-constructed it. And the other theme is the theme of censorship. So maybe let's try to respond to both, the political economy and the censorship and freedom. Dorota, would you like to take the lead? Mike, please.
Yeah, I wanted to answer first about this efforts of governments about exporting art. In Poland, we had luck. Sometimes we had luck in the past, and we managed to convince AICA Poland had a very important played an important role in it. We convinced the Minister of Culture, Mr. Dąbrowski, that the best way what did we really say to him? We convinced him to support the presence of Polish artists in the art fairs in the world. Means that some of us had the opinion that the cultural politics, which relies on sending governmental exhibitions to the West, to the public institutions, makes no sense, that in this way we will never promote our artists, that we have to use the market means which come from the market. And since I don't remember 2004 or 2005, this government and the next government were giving financial support for the galleries to present Polish artists in the art fairs. And this turned to be a very successful politics In this way, we promoted quite a relatively big group of Polish painters like Wilhelm Sasnal or Paulina Łowska through the market. We don't like the market, but the market is the most effective means in promoting the artists. So we decided just to use the same means, which we find, saying cynically, which are in the other parts of the world. So this is my answer to this question. And what was another question? It's very important because in this way, by this art fest, we entered the international exchange, yeah, with on the same rules as everybody else. Yeah.
Actually, I think the second question in the Polish context might be linked in a sense, because there is this sentiment now that the private sector might provide a certain sense of artistic freedom in the face of the.
In this, I don't believe. I mean,
me neither, but this is a proposition that
I believe in promoting artists through the market means, and they are very effective. But concerning freedom, it is very complicated. And in fact, I observed what happened after 2000, when there was a new wave of censorship, of political censorship in Poland. And the artists had no place to hide, let's say, no place to exhibit for 2 years, I think, or 3 years. And the private sector, no, they tried to organize themselves in cooperatives, for example, but this allowed only to be active on the very low level. And because art needs money, needs money, needs institutions, needs art criticism, needs freedom, needs open space at which the ideas of the artists can freely compete. Whatever utopian is my idea about it, my concept. And now, of course, the art market is more developed in Poland than it was in 2000, and there are more collectors in Poland and more mighty collectors in Poland, but still there are very few. There are more, but still very few. So how can they help? Especially if the biggest collector just left Poland and made her museum in Switzerland, yeah, because of the political pressure which is in Poland. I know even more collectors who exported their collections to Luxembourg or to Switzerland, being afraid of law and justice politics in Poland. So I don't see big future that the private money and private institutions can really support the artists and the art in Poland. And especially they will never support the new ideas, because usually it is more conservative in our countries, this private part of the art scene, let's say. Yeah. Of course, we have galleries. I'm thinking still about this question. We have commercial galleries, and there is quite a wide range of art which is exhibited there. Yeah, but still it has to be about object. I mean, you know, because you have to sell. So I think that the activist art in Poland has just passed the highest peak. I think. That's
Attila,
it for me for now.
What's your perspective on the two issues I mentioned, the political economy and the censorship and freedom currently?
You shouldn't ask these questions to me because I'm so pessimistic.
Attila, are you maybe more optimist?
Dear Dorota, you cannot be more pessimistic than I am. That's my answer, my very short answer. On the other hand, You see, what I was trying to explain was that Hungarian art is not really well represented elsewhere. The reason is there is not much concern behind it. There's no real power to to back it up. That means that it is not taken seriously in any ways, and that means and one of the consequences of this in this country is that in terms of culture, contemporary fine art is basically nowhere. And that means, in the end, that it can do whatever it wants. There is no censorship. I don't really see any censorship. There could be. I mean, you could probably find in more important. I mean, if you went to the Hungarian National Gallery and there is this exhibition of Yula Derkovic, and a very important painter from before the during the First World War and afterwards a little bit, who basically well, in a sense died of hunger and was probably a left-wing artist, an important kind of socialist artist. And so some of his when his exhibition was mounted, perhaps a few ideas came. Is that comme il faut right now to put it to represent it at the National Gallery? And such questions do arise from time to time. But on the whole, there is no. I don't really see any censorship in that sense, because it's just not important. What I see, which is not really censorship, but rather the way various cultural institutions, including artistic fine art institutions, are centralized and also are kind of directors are appointed who are directly, directors are basically appointed not simply by the government or the state, but rather by the party, by the Fidesz. And some of them actually are verbally. I mean, they're giving these interviews, saying that yes, they are 100% loyal to our Prime Minister Viktor Orbán and his politics, and which means that they are not critical in any sense, and that means that the cultural institutions, fine art or literary art or other types, are not going to be critical in any sense. And this is, I suppose, the big problem. So it's not so much censorship as in terms of certain art being produced or certain exhibitions being mounted, but rather whether certain institutions, how certain institutions are run. And the more important institutions, the National Gallery, the National Museum, and most importantly, it's called Petőfi Literary Museum, that has now a director who is really beyond, I mean, below anything. I mean, it's and he has so much power. The big central library belongs to him. The music industry, pop music industry, belongs to him. Basically, 60% of Hungarian cultural industry, I might be wrong, perhaps it's just 50%, but in some ways he has power over these institutions. Now that is, I mean, this is a less than 30 years, or perhaps 30 or 40 years old, kind of like young man who tries to bully basically everyone who thinks that Viktor Orbán is a problematic politician. And his cultural politics kind of runs according to his politics, his party politics, and this is the problem. So when we come to censorship, it's not so much whether a certain exhibition is allowed or not. I don't really see that as a problem, or whether you know, it never happens what happened in the 60s or 70s, that they were just shut down after a day. That doesn't happen because they're just not important. They're not taken important. But government, central government occupies these places and creates kind of like a false national sort of narrative in these various institutions. And this takes up much of the amount of money that's being spent on culture in this country, and also the spaces. So what happens is there are fewer and fewer independent spaces that are larger than let's say, an apartment. Also, just like in the Thatcher era, new very small venues surface, and you know, small art communities come together and create spaces and create an interesting kind of like underground culture. And this is absolutely important. The big problem is that you cannot kind of like appear with, you know, institutions of that small size, micro institutions, and their production, their exhibitions on a, you know, on a larger environment. It's just impossible to do that. So it becomes local and never grows over, because the next steps, and this is an important structural problem here, that the next steps, there is a vibrant underground artistic subculture perhaps, that is basically not funded or just very little funded. But the next possible steps are just taken away, and perhaps just very few things remain, like Venice Biennale, that is kind of, you know, important artists may go there, but it's just, it doesn't create a viable kind of like life perspective for an artist. I start from here, I go there, and I create what is important, and I try to, you know, go ahead on my own way. It's just impossible, because there is this impossible gap between the you know, the smaller institutions that are authentic, and the larger ones that are by and large inauthentic. That's how I see the censorship problem.
I'm afraid that we go in your direction in Poland. I mean the Hungarian direction, as in any other field, because at the moment we have acts of censorship. I mean, they were put down from the exhibition, the works of Natalia L. in the National Museum and in the Museum of the Second World War. But in general, it is a fight about history. Who speaks the history? Who tells the history? Yeah? And there will be less and less acts of censorship, because the government exchanges the directors of the main institutions from the ones who were competent to the ones who are not competent but have certain political standpoints. Yeah. So, you know, we don't know what happens, because still in two institutions there are still programs which were planned by the previous directors, but we don't know what happens next year. Yeah, what will be their own ideas how to run the institutions. And we are really frightened, because it is also a fight against the intellectuals. I mean that these museums, these exhibitions, were the place where the intellectuals, Polish elites met. And when these institutions are overtaken, then we really have no place to go, I would say. The place where all we can meet, where all we can agree to meet in this place, you know. I don't want to be so dramatic, you know, but you really cause me to react to what you are saying about.
Just one sentence. Let me just say one sentence. So the reason Hungarian AICA's official address is my home address is pretty much this, that we cannot trust any of our institutions anymore that used to house AICA, the National Gallery, Műcsarnok, or any other ones. So what remains is basically the president's home address becomes AICA Hungary's official address, and this is absurd, absolutely absurd.
If I might, I will use my power to stretch our discussion a little bit, maybe 10 minutes, because we still have a couple, no, 5, okay. But Jana, do you have any comments on censorship and artistic freedom in Slovakia right now?
Maybe not, because I think that the worst situation in Slovakia was in 90s. And I absolutely understand Attila, how he described the situation in actually situation. And in our country, the direct problem with the censorship is not. I would like underline, for instance, very provocative art. Feminist art is now a part of a collection of not only Slovak National Gallery, but also regional gallery. And this is a very, very positive. But I understand, Attila, your situation, and I am very, very sorry about it.
Now to somehow wrap up this discussion, 2 more voices from the audience. And Magda wrote to us, suggested that we should maybe include countries like Romania and Bulgaria or Serbia. And here I would like to maybe say sorry, because I perhaps didn't stress enough that the project is centered on Visegrad countries. And but as Małgosia already wrote, the Bulgarians and Romanians are more than welcome in the AICA, in the regional secretary of AICA, which we have just established as a common effort. But maybe it is topical in a sense, and I could rephrase this into a question, asking how do you judge the quality and intensity of exchange between art writers in our region in general? Do we really know about each other well enough? And then another question we received, and this is the last one we can take, from, again, Karachi. I can see many parallels between Eastern Europe and South Asian countries, where after the impact of 200 years of colonization, we faced modernism that continues to undervalue and exclude local art traditions and knowledge. Can any of the panelists share if artists in Eastern Europe reconnect with their pre-modern or pre-Soviet art practices to construct a new identity, and how did critical writers respond to it? So there are 2 issues, communication within the region and the issue of the pre-modern or pre-Soviet. These are 2 interrelated, but maybe quite different things. But maybe you'd like to respond to it somehow. So first, maybe Attila, since you showed to me that I shouldn't stretch too much, so I will let you take the lead.
Yeah, thank you. In terms of us knowing each other well enough, I'm afraid to say that when it comes to certain persons, that is certain art critics, they do have connections in the region. But if we kind of, that means that there is a there is an understanding and knowledge of what's going on in the region, but it's in very small scale. I would say that in general, at least in Hungary, we are not really knowledgeable, and by we I mean, you know, the Hungarian fine art scene perhaps may not be that knowledgeable about, you know, the regional happenings that are going on in our respective countries, not well enough. And this might be, you know, it was there was an effort by an online paper, a blog of sorts perhaps, that applied for Visegrad funding, I think, and invited art critics from the region to visit Hungary and sent Hungarian art critics to countries in the region, and also published, it teamed up with various publications from the region and published their reviews in translation. That happened. So, and there are such efforts, but on the whole, I would say that we are not very good at this communication. As for the other question, I find it really, really complicated and would not really want to enter into it, whether we have a connection to pre-Soviet era art. Well, of course, but what does that mean? I mean, it's before 1945. I mean, most of the questions that arose in between the two world wars or before the First World War in terms of art are not really relevant here. So it's not that easy to connect to that one. We do have an art historical understanding of what was going on and its relevance even to our current situation, but I wouldn't say that before 1945 most of the most art is kind of like live and relevant here. As in terms of before pre-modernist whatever art, there is a continuous presence of perhaps a type of art that is not necessarily pre-modern. It's kind of like a is like a Barbizon type of school art that is present all the time. And it's sometimes it's the most liked type of art in by the larger public. So this kind of these landscapes and all sorts of things. But if you ask, or if this question was pointed at for instance folk art, well, it appears and it does not. So it's just not an easy subject, and would need a discussion on its own. It is pretty much an art historical question, I would say, not so much an art critical question.
I think it's quite vital to stress, though, that the pre-Soviet and pre-modernist or pre-modern are two rather different things in the region, at least in Poland. And there is even a tradition or plural traditions of so to speak, conservative modernism that is very much attached to nationalist identity and particular cultural traditions instead of the universalizing Soviet influence. So this I do agree is a very, very complex subject matter. Dorota, would you like to respond?
Yes. I was thinking about this question before our discussion, and there were two initiatives which were, in my opinion, not very successful. First, it was the art magazine Presence, which was published around 2000. And now we have a magazine Block, and which is published in English. And I saw today that many authors contribute to this magazine. For us, for our network, it was very important, Piotr Piotrowski. And when I needed authors for my catalogs, then I was always checking at Magdalena Radomska or another student of Piotr Piotrowski to tell me who is writing about what, if I wanted the author from Czech, Slovak, or Hungary, or no, just let's keep with that. When I was running the museum, I had in my program that we include that it was a strong point of the program to cooperate with the countries of the Visegrad Group. So we had the retrospective of Jiří Kovanda. We had a great exhibition of Slovak conceptual art. we had plans to make, unfortunately, I stopped to be a director in 2016, but my next plan was to have the group, the PECH group from Hungary, to have the exhibition in our museum, because especially we were interested in the conceptual art in the Central Europe, and this kind of exhibitions we invited to our museum, because the city Wrocław, where I was working, was very important for this movement in Poland. And and we also made exhibitions in Košice, in Zagreb, in Budapest, unfortunately not in Prague. So this exchange was very intensive. I mean, the years 2009, 2016. Also, AICA was making, Andrzej Szczerski was making a congress in Bratislava. So there were many occasions to meet each other and to get to know each other. So I'm not so critical about this. And in Poland especially, we had the exhibition of Slovak artists. There was this lady exhibition was before, I think, Biennale, the one from Košice. I've forgotten the name at the moment, this Slovak artist. But also we had this program to buy art, and I bought altogether 14 artworks from 14 artists from, I counted before our meeting, from Hungary and Slovak Republic and Czech Republic. So we bought 5 artists from Hungary, 5 artists during the 5 years, 5 artists from Czech, and 4 artists from Slovak. And these were the older generation artists and the youngest artists. So I used to look at it in a very positive way, that we know quite a lot about our neighbors, and we had special reports in our newspapers. Colleagues went to Hungary to report on the art scene in Hungary and about the limitations of this art scene, what's going on there. So I mean, in the professional circles, we are very well, I think, quite not bad informed. And also we presented this art to our public. So it also caused the critical texts. So it was followed by art criticism. And so I would be rather optimistic about this conference's next step. Yeah, I'm quite optimistic about this. I am very happy. This is my last sentence. In the 90s, when I wanted to see colleagues from Hungary or Slovak Republic or Czech Republic, I had to go to Budapest, to Vienna, because there was Laurent Hedgy, who was making the exhibitions of Central European art in the MUMOK, the then MUMOK, yeah. And now I made exhibitions in these countries. Colleagues from these countries make exhibitions in Poland. We don't need the third entity to meet together and to talk together. So I think it's a big progress. Thank you.
And Jana, would you like to give a quick response?
I agree with Dorota, because I am also not very pessimistic. And I am very glad that Dorota mentioned the magazine presence, which was really very, very important and very good prepared. The initiative was the Hungarian colleague, and there was a very special structure, because together with the Budapest editorial staff, there was a network of regional editors who mapped events in the countries of Central and Eastern Europe, including Slovakia, Czech Republic, Slovenia, Croatia, Poland, Macedonia, but also Austria. And it was a mix of this West and East. And it is really pity that the magazine was finished maybe after 4 years existing. And I also would like mention the cooperation with the Hungarian section of AICA when Erzsébet Tatai was president of AICA Hungarian, and we together organized in 2000 international symposium, and the title was Conceptual Art in the Beginning of New Millennium. And it was also based on cooperation between Slovak, Czech, Croatian artists, and the most important speaker was Tony Godfrey from London, and he wrote the very important book Conceptual Art, which was published in 1998, 2 years before our symposium. It was very actual in this time, and therefore I am not so pessimistic, and I would like to add only one platform which has created only years ago, and it is secondary archive, and I mean that it was based with the cooperation with a Polish artist Kozira Foundation. It is a very good open platform for registration women artists from countries, Visegrad countries.
Hard to disagree. Thank you, Jana. Thank you, Dorota. And thank you, Attila. Big bravo to our amazing speakers. And just to get back to the chat in a very brief manner, Marta van Mechelen referred back to the past, saying perhaps a bit ironically that in 1978 it was an advantage that there was a Berlin Wall, because that created the possibility of exchange between most of the Central and Eastern European countries and the West. Otherwise, it would have been only Poland and Yugoslavia. So here we have the past, and then a few other participants referred not to the past, but to the future. So here, standing at the brink of the past and the future, in this very moment, I'd like to say thank you to all of you, and the suggestions for future collaboration, doing paper calls, organizing a conference, and even a bigger symposium on art criticism in our region. We will take this into account and try to work on these suggestions. At the very end, I would like to maybe ask Małgorzata to say a few words about the publication schedule, and when, because this is also a question that appeared in the chat, when and how can we get the upcoming book? Małgosia, are you here with us?
Yes, I'm really happy that before we even started to work on the anthology, we sold it all. But yes, well, this roundtable discussion today is the first step that we took. Okay, so the discussion today is supposed to be like a collective introduction to the book. So we are going to transcript it, and it's going to make an introduction. And then we plan to, of course, translate the text, and we plan to publish it by the end of the next year. So yes, and of course it will be available, and we plan to make it available in paper and PDF version. So obviously I will let you know once it's ready.
Thank you, Małgosia, and once again, thank you for the invitation. It was pleasure. It was a pleasure to moderate this discussion. And I guess there are some voices. Dorota wanted to say something, but for now, I will say thank you, and this is my last word.
Thank you.
Thank you, Arkadiusz, for your great moderation, and thank you to all the speakers and Małgorzata for this great organization. And of course, AICA International will communicate about the next steps, and of course about the launch of the book. So thank you, everyone. take care. And see you maybe next week for our next webinar organized by the Latin Americans and South Caribbean sections. It will be on the next Thursday. So maybe see you next week. Take care, everyone.